In terms of reporters, Sans Frontières, Reporters Without Borders have just ranked freedom of the press much higher in Timor-Leste than here in Australia. You need to understand that Timor-Leste is doing better than we are in terms of press freedom. So I think that's a bit of a wake-up call, hopefully, for our country. So they've just had a presidential election. I've been over there, I've just come back. That was great, haven't been in 2.5 years. And so I'll give you an update from the field, as it were. And then I want to talk about some key state-building policy challenges, hopefully leave a bit of time for questions. That photo was on the cover of a book I co-edited with Professor Damien Kingsbury called The Politics of Timor-Leste. And I really like it because you can see the three influences on Timorese society. You can see it in the lulik, which means the sacred, the bullhorns there, representing the lulik tradition. The church, of course, just above that in the cross. And the nation, the Timorese flag, sitting there on the front. I can now reveal that was a complete setup by the photographer. The flag wasn't there. The people who lived there didn't know the photographer was putting a flag there, but it's a great photo. It was on the front of a book about Timor-Leste. So I'll give you a political overview and some key challenges. Just where are we? Well, this month is the 20th anniversary of the restoration of independence. Obviously, Timor was independent briefly for 9 days in 1975, before the Indonesian invasion of Timor-Leste. There was a unilateral declaration of independence on 28th November 1975. 9 days later, Indonesia invaded. 24-year struggle for independence. That followed hot on the heels of 450 years of Portuguese colonialism. And those twin colonial legacies continue to inform Timorese politics. Then there was distinctively 3 years or 2.5 years of UNTAIT of the UN directly governing a territory. That had only happened briefly in places like West Papua, years and years ago. This was the most substantial period of UN direct governance of the territory, and now it's 20 years of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste having its independence restored. So Timor-Leste is a semi-presidential system, and in short, that means that there is a president and a prime minister, and they share executive powers. That's what defines a semi-presidential system. The French, who invented this system, came up with the term cohabitation for when the president comes from one party and the prime minister comes from another party. And this happened at various periods over the last 5 years and caused some tensions. So a power-sharing government was in place from 2015 to 2017. I'm just giving you a bit of background here, with the two major parties, CNRT and Fretland, cooperating. That broke down. Fretland's Luola was elected president with the support of Fretland, obviously, but also the informal support of Shenana Guzmao, who's as the CNRT party. That was very much the last act of those two parties getting on well, and there was the installation of a Fretland minority government after parliamentary elections that was unable to pass its program in the end, so there was an early parliamentary election in 2018. And in that election, Shenana Guzmao's CNRT and a couple of other parties won. That alliance broke down, though, in 2020 because of some tensions between the Parliament and the President. And Fretland replaced the CNRT in that alliance government in 2020. So it's a complicated picture. But basically, the President has certain executive powers and, among other things, refused to install 7 ministers from the CNRT, which was controversial. The President does have the power to refuse ministers, but refusing that many was controversial, citing corruption inquiries and so on, moral issues about moral standing, but in the case of those 7, there were no actual charges, so there was a question of the presumption of innocence too. So you see some cohabitation tensions in the last 5 years in Timor-Leste. What that meant was Guzmao made a high-risk move. He did not pass the budget of his own government. His party did not pass the budget of his alliance government, leaving his 2 alliance partners out in the cold. That was a move to try and force an early election. It failed. Chalmatan Ruat from the PLP remained to be the Prime Minister with the support of the President, and Fretland came in as the large party to replace CNRT in this alliance. I realise this is complicated, but there's a parliamentary alliance that forms the majority of the Parliament. That's where government is formed, but the President has certain powers. They can veto legislation, and they also have the power to appoint governments and, in certain circumstances, to dissolve Parliament. So this government ended up continuing, despite the largest party pulling out of its support, because it was replaced by Fretland. So the President, who was from Fretland, was able to engineer this. And that's the 3 parties in power right now. And of course that meant that Shenana Guzmão, who's sort of the kingpin of Timorese politics, has been out of power for 2 years now. And in that time he's been building his CNRT party in opposition. This government faced very big challenges last year. Obviously the pandemic that affected all of Southeast Asia and the world. Timor-Leste performed very well in 2020 with COVID. There was an outbreak in 2021, but Timor-Leste has a very young population, median age 18. Obviously, that's a protective factor. It's not good if you are an older Timorese, but society-wide, that's a protective factor, and I think they ended up having 130 deaths. It wasn't a very high death rate, but it was a big challenge, and especially when devastating floods hit Dili in April 2021. And at that point, all social distancing went out the window, forget about it, because of, look, you can see what had happened. This is a product of climate change, of course, but also of massive rural to urban migration to Dili and shanty towns, and of course that unregulated building codes means the flow of water is worse. The drainage is designed for a city of about a third the size of what it is now, and so that's another part of the challenge, which again goes to the need for decentralisation and so on, keeping people in the regions, and that people are coming to the capital for economic opportunities, the same sort of thing you see in Melanesia. I've just come back from the presidential elections where José Ramos Horta won the presidency for the second time. He was president from 2007 to 2012. He won the runoff round against the incumbent, Fretlands Luolo, by 62% to 38. I'll show you those numbers in a second. This, if you like, is the first in a two-step strategy by Shenana Guzmão to get back into power. Now he's got an ally in the president's chair. That's going to prove useful because the president has important executive powers around the appointment of government. But that's not the end of the story. There now needs to be either a parliamentary election, which Shenana Guzmão would hope to win to get back into power, or some reformulation of the current parliament around with different parties included. So that's step two of Shenana trying to get back into power. Whether that happens is as yet unknown. As it stands, the PLP Junto Fretland government is standing firm. Technically, the parliamentary election is due next year, so they've got another year of their cycle. Shenana wants an early election. That's what he's trying to achieve. And step one of trying to achieve that is getting an ally in the president's chair, which he did. And here's it's like the French system. There's there's a round one, and if nobody gets 50%, you go to round two. You can see that Ramos Horta did very, very well in round one, but not quite well enough to avoid the runoff. Francisco Luolo Guterres is the incumbent current president. You can see he ended up getting about 38% of the vote in the runoff, and Ramos Horta won comfortably, big majority of 62%. He will be installed as the president of Timor-Leste on May 20, the anniversary of the restoration of independence, in about 2 weeks. In fact, it's exactly 2 weeks. So, does this mean the return of Guzmão? Question mark. That's a question mark because that hasn't happened yet. Guzmão wants to return obviously to the Prime Minister's chair, or at least having his party in government, whether he wants to be the actual PM or not. He wants to return to power, whereupon he would no doubt prosecute further his vision of the Greater Sunrise oil and gas processing onshore on Timor-Leste, which has been controversial. Here's the maritime boundaries established in 2018 and 19 with Australia. East Timor was the only country that did not have maritime boundaries with Australia because Australia was refusing to settle maritime boundaries. There was a big campaign by the Timorese, and of course a lot of Australians jumped in that campaign, and they were successful. Now you'll see that Timor-Leste, unlike Indonesia, has a median line boundary with Australia. So if I can point to it, here's the boundary with Indonesia, established in 1972 on the continental shelf principles, much closer to Indonesia, that's West Timor. The Timorese have a median line boundary, and then it goes back to the continental shelf. You see why Australia didn't want to settle a continental shelf, didn't want to settle a median line boundary with Timor-Leste because it had such a sweet deal with Indonesia from 1972. And there's a lot of oil and gas in there. That is the Greater Sunrise Field, the big red one here, and you'll see that Australia has ended up still with a proportion of that. That would be 20% of that if processing goes to Darwin. or 30% if it goes to Timor-Leste. And that's what Shenandoah Guzmão wants that oil and gas to go across that rather deep trench to the south coast of Timor-Leste, where he has a plan called Tasamane, which means the south coast processing plant, which is controversial. There are some technical challenges as well because it's such a deep trench compared to the shallow, even though it's further to Australia. But that's been a high priority of Shenandoah Guzmão for many, many years. If he's back into power, then no doubt he would be trying to prosecute that, which would obviously bring Australia back into the question because Australia would have to approve any development concept because there's still a sharing of the Greater Sunrise on that boundary. But you can see what was previously the Joint Petroleum Development Area, that was shared by Australia and Timor, is now completely Timorese sovereign waters. But these fields are about to run out. So the Greater Sunrise is the one that still has the oil and gas in it. So it was nice of us to give Timor-Leste their rights under international law once the oil and gas had practically run out. And then we've got the Great Sunrise, where that is still yet to be developed. So there you go. So he hasn't returned to power though. Currently, it's the PLP Junto Fretland government. And this is a bit of a standoff now. We're going to be back in a cohabitation situation very shortly, in about 2 weeks, when Ramos Horta is back being president, that you will have again a president supported, he's an independent, but he's supported by CNRT, so effectively a cohabitation situation with a prime minister of one stripe and a president of another. In this interim, before Ramos Horta takes his presidency on May 20, the government has controversially been introducing some new legislation. The current government is seeking a budget rectification before Horta becomes president, which is the largest ever and includes a $1 billion fund for veterans. In the Timorese context, this means veterans of the military struggle against Indonesia, Falantil veterans. And they have been a focus of the post-independence state to recognise their sacrifices and contributions. This is a very, very large recognition of that. Obviously, there's an electoral side to this for any forthcoming parliamentary elections. There's a new martial arts and ritual arts HQ being proposed. Junto is a party that comes out of martial arts movements. It's got an overlap with martial arts groups, in this case Cork. A lot of martial arts groups were set up during the Indonesian era by the Indonesians, and they continue in Timor-Leste, and they have increasing political significance. Then there's a host of less controversial items in this budget rectification, but you can see they have a sort of electoral weight. This would tax the petroleum fund rather seriously. It would be a $3.2 billion budget if passed, and they're trying to pass it while Luolo is still president. You see, they're trying to pass it before May 20, because Horta's already said he would veto. Presidents can veto legislation. They don't have positive policy powers, but they have negative ones. Can veto this. Come May 21, this would not get through, according to Ramos Horta, who would have that power. This is taxing the petroleum fund, the estimated sustainable income from the petroleum fund, where the Timorese wisely keep their funds, oil and gas funds, generates a certain amount of interest each year, and that's considered the estimated sustainable income because you're not going into the principal. This would be 4 times the estimated sustainable income, this budget. This has happened before, where the estimated sustainable income has been exceeded, but never quite by this amount. At this rate, the petroleum fund will be empty in 10 to 15 years. And the problem with that is that Timor needs to economically diversify before that happens. Very reliant on oil and gas, very dependent on oil and gas expenditure. The state's expenditure of oil and gas funds drives a lot of the economic activity. So you see, and these of course finite resources, when they run out, Timor had best have some other industries, and preferably ones that generate a lot of jobs. Oil and gas doesn't generate a lot of jobs. It's mostly the state spending of revenues that generates jobs. So, only yesterday I found out about another bill that's been proposed on the criminal liability of the President for misuse of presidential powers. So, Parliament is trying to fill in legislative detail of some things that are in the Constitution around potential criminal liability for the President misusing presidential power. So you see, this hasn't been passed yet, but it's an apparent response to the threat of the dissolution of Parliament. So Shenandoah Guzmão wants Parliament dissolved early. That would be a constitutionally controversial move, by the way. Dissolution of Parliament normally occurs in circumstances where you can't form a government or a budget hasn't passed or something. When there's a majority that is a majority, it's not under threat, it's still got the confidence of the majority of Parliament. It is a controversial move to try and dissolve Parliament. I'm not suggesting it's unconstitutional, but I'm certainly suggesting that it's a controversial move. Though the President may indeed have those powers, the Court of Appeal in Timor has refused to review presidential executive discretions unless there's an impeachment. So the President may well have that power, but it's certainly a politically and constitutionally vexed pathway. Nonetheless, the parliamentary response here of introducing a bill at this point in time, which they claim these bills do exist in similar semi-presidential systems. But introducing it right now is an interesting timing. It's obviously part of stepping up a kind of confrontation between the Parliament and the President. It's an obvious sign of forthcoming cohabitation tensions returning. So I don't have a full analysis of this proposed bill by any means because I've only heard about it last night and I had to change my PowerPoint and send it to you. Like literally that's just happened. So I don't have a full, definitive analysis yet of that, but that's an update. So to conclude, I've got about 4 minutes. Key policy issues for the next 10 years. Before I talk about those, I want to give you some context. The HDI in Timor-Leste is up substantially, 1.48 to 0.6 over that 20-year period, 25% increase. That's great news. Poverty estimates, though, range from 42 to 46, depending whether you're looking at the poverty line or multi-dimensional indicators. That's substantial, and it's much higher in the rural areas than in Dili, Balkan. Unemployment's estimated at 4.8%. In a subsistence economy, I'm often a bit suspicious of the term unemployment because livelihoods is a much more useful term because, subsistence farmers, really, employment, they're not exactly the same concept. But, in the cities, youth unemployment is estimated at, when I say cities, Dili and Balkan, youth unemployment is estimated at 12.3%. Obviously, that's much higher than the official overall rate. And median age of 18. So you need to understand that half of Timor-Leste is under 18 and half is over 18. And in Australia, it would be 38, the equivalent figure. So low levels of tertiary vocational educational attainment and poor graduate employment outcomes. Urban-rural disparities are quite substantial in Timor-Leste, safe water access, child mortality rates, nutrition rates, and so on. So I just wanted to give you that developmental context before we look at, which I think it might be on my final slide, the key policy issues for the next 10 years. Economic diversification is the big one. So Timor is running off its oil and gas revenues, royalties. They're in a petroleum fund, so they're earning interest. The problem is that the Timorese governments are spending above that estimated sustainable, above that. They're going into the principal every year. That's been going on for years, by the way. This government didn't invent that. However, this government's really stepped it up with this latest budget rectification. Oil and gas dependence, I think it's the second most oil and gas dependent country in the world after South Sudan. Youth policy is a really big challenge when you have a median age of 18. Obviously, when it's 38 here in Australia, there's a small proportion here in Australia that you've got to find education and job opportunities for young adults. In Timor, it's much higher. Half the population is under 18, so every year you've got to find job opportunities and education opportunities. Labour migration is a big part of that at the moment in the absence, if you like, of economic diversification. A lot of Timorese are going overseas. There was a pathway to Britain on their Portuguese passports. You've got to bear in mind that Timorese born before May 20, 2002 are eligible for Portuguese passports because Portugal remained under international law, the administering power. Nobody recognised the Indonesian occupation except partly Australia. And so they have Portuguese passports, they've been able to go to Britain. That pathway has closed with Brexit. And now more and more Timorese are going to be coming to Australia. Some go to South Korea. Labour migration is a big issue, but of course, that's no substitute for economic diversification in the country of Timor-Leste itself. Decentralisation is another big challenge. You saw the floods, Dili, the massive populations. It's not Port Moresby. Dili's a very safe town, actually, but it's already overcrowded, or it needs major infrastructure upgrades. Either way, opportunities need to be provided in the regional capitals, the district capitals, and in the regions. The Dili infrastructure, the flood risk is through the roof in terms of these shantytown structures. Some 10,000 were washed away in the floods. Obviously, this is a big issue. Creating job opportunities and training opportunities in the districts of Timor-Leste, so people don't have to go to Dili, is obviously a multifactorial kind of policy that any government department would be wanting to pursue. Political transitions, I think is my final point here. Timor-Leste, as you would have seen from the photos, is still dominated by the 1975 generation of political leaders. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for that. People who fought in the war against Indonesia have a lot of political legitimacy, the resistance, and that sits on top of a traditional reverence for older, particularly older male figures, but older people generally, that comes from tradition, in Timorese society. So it's reinforced in a couple of ways. But this is surely in 2022 to 2023 the last round of elections where this particular group would dominate. Shenanigans Mao is 76, Ramaphosa is 72, Mari Alpatiri is 72. It's difficult to see how they do this again in 5 years' time. Although then there's Mahathir, we were talking about this morning who's, goes on forever. So hopefully let's not mention the Mahathir model. The transition to younger leaders and the inclusion of more women is obviously a big challenge that's going to be taking place over the next 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was really so rich that you managed to pack so much into your. And I'm particularly interested in the martial arts and the kunto, but I might open it up to the floor first. Catherine.
Thanks so much, Michael. That was fascinating. Really enjoyed it.
We're just going to get the microphone for you,
sure.
Catherine. Thank you. And Michael, I'm going to get you to stand.
Thanks, Michael. That was super interesting. My question is about this sort of what seems to me like a tension about this heavy reliance on oil and gas and an awareness that it's running out or maybe isn't sufficient anymore already. And then this sort of urban flooding and effects of climate change already having a very immediate effect. And I'm curious about, is there a narrative around how to address that within Timor-Leste? Is there political will? Are there sort of social movements who are looking for both economic diversification and ways to mitigate against climate change? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. It's the big question. Yeah, look, if you go to civil society, one of the reasons that Timor is so democratic is that civil society is so active. And there are any number of civil society organisations who have a really well-formed analysis of this. Their influence on political parties, though, is not, in my opinion, not yet substantial enough. And that is dominated by political parties. Political parties use the party list system. So the party list system is, in a proportional system, you've got to get towards the top of the list to be elected. And that just creates yes men and women. And every third person has to be a woman on the party list system. So Timor has a high level of women in parliament, by the way. But it also creates yes women. So that system, you've got to please the leaders. So you really need to convert the political leadership to this economic diversification agenda. And of course, it's so easy when money is flowing to use oil and gas revenues as a tool to reinforce your electoral success. And we're seeing that reinforce your electoral appeal, I should say. And we're seeing that going on. So, that runs against the idea that, the clock's ticking here. So, but Timor has a very active civil society. So they are certainly aware of these issues and they're very, very active. And younger people are getting more confident and older people are getting older. Expect to see some change, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Up the back here. We'll just wait for the microphone, sorry.
Hello, thank you for that. Look, just first on this business about an active civil society, is that basically in Dili, or do you see that kind of thing starting to happen in the rural areas?
Yeah, look,
given the disparities.
Good question. Yes, there are rural equivalents, but it's not the same level as Dili, where the education level is much higher, where the liberation from the daily routines of childbearing and so on are much higher. Rural Timor-Leste is a different situation, and you've got to be in the fields because it's subsistence agriculture and it's harvest time, and those rhythms haven't changed as much. So it's more active in Dili.
And if I could then what actually accounts for such a dramatic increase in the state budget with this currently proposed budget? Is any of that going to respond to conditions in the rural area?
Some of it is, if I can go back to that. So there's some stuff in there for the coffee industry, housing and scholarship programs. The 13th month payment is something that civil servants get. You get like a 13th month at Christmas. They're proposing to give that to each household around Timor-Leste, so I'm sure that would be welcome. But this is really, those are items there, which I've called the less controversial items, are a very small part of the budget. But they do partly recognise the need for more spending in the rural areas. What accounts for it is there's a parliamentary election coming. It's more important than the presidential elections. That's where government is formed. And the current government is obviously using this opportunity where they've still got a president who's on side to spend a whole lot of money to increase their electoral appeal.
Yeah.
And that's what's, I think, accounts for a lot of that. There's some good programs in there too, but they're just a small percentage of that budget. Yeah. But, you know, the other side has done that too over many years. Not to this level though. So, you know, it's not like this is unprecedented spending money on veterans. Oh, in fact, there's been heaps of that, you know, which is another reason why it's so, you know, it's a questionable policy because there's been a lot of expenditure already on veterans by other governments.
Hi Michael, my name is Tamara Magoa.
Tamara,
yes.
Tamara.
Hi. I'm interested in your point about leadership transition and wanted to ask about if there's any processes like youth parliament or youth forums which are being introduced to consider more rights for the younger population, which is obviously sizable and that could change kind of decision making around employment or climate change if there was more representation.
Good question. Not really, but what you are seeing is new parties forming. So Kunto here is based on, you know, there's a strong basis in a particular martial arts group, but you would also characterise it as a youth-based party more broadly, and certainly a rural youth. Rural youth is where they really get a lot of their votes. So they are tapping into that, and it is a missing part of the market. Every party in Timor-Leste needs to have a youth policy because of you know, the number of voters who are young. You know, you can vote at 17, by the way, in Timor-Leste. And so there's a lot of young voters, and every election there's more, you know. So every party needs to have a youth policy, but some of the new party developments are really, I think, on that dynamic of young voters, like Kunto, a new party, Party 4 is coming through. I think they'll be pitching for part of the youth vote. There's a new Greens party emerging, although they probably also have a martial arts background as well. But anyway, you know, there's a lot of people involved in martial arts in Timor-Leste. So, yeah, that's where you're seeing the youth kind of shifting that dynamic a bit, is in new patterns of political party formation. So that's the thing to keep an eye on. I'm not aware of any kind of youth parliament.
Time for one last question. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I think my question was just asked, but I was just going to ask, was there a sense that Guzmão and Ramos-Horta are losing their lustre among those younger voters, particularly seeing as the median age is so young? But I think you've just answered it.
Yeah, look, it's hard to tell from voting data about age. We can tell gender things from voting data, where people are, we can sort of infer certain conclusions. They're still very popular. All those older leaders are still very popular, but they're probably not quite as popular as they used to be, and there's new contenders, new emerging all the time too, and obviously as that voting median age drops, people need to be pitching. Here's the key thing, it's very hard to pitch your legacy as a resistance fighter to somebody who wasn't born when Indonesia occupied Timor-Leste and doesn't remember that era and wasn't there. Obviously, every 5 years, that gets harder and harder to go off your resistance legitimacy, and increasingly I didn't talk about policy issues.
Okay, I think we have time for one last
Oh,
question.
sorry, I
Back to
don't want to
Catherine at
hold.
the front. We're right up against it.
All right, I'm just forming this on the spot. I hope it comes out okay. I'm also really curious because I'm interested in institutional trust And often in cases where politicians have very high levels of personal status, that can sometimes be associated with populist type thinking, where there's low levels of trust in institutional process. And is that the case in Timor-Leste, or is there a different dynamic going on?
No, I think that'd be an astute analysis of Timor-Leste and the institutions there. The key figures are trusted more than the institutions. There's a kind of sense of a bureaucratic inertia in Timor-Leste often. People have certainly been attributing that to the current government. Of course, they were facing floods and COVID. But I remember that being said about the previous government too. There is a sense that very senior leaders can push through the bureaucratic inertia better than some younger people, because they just walk in a room and everyone does what they, and everyone suddenly drops all the processes and everything and just does it, So there's a sense that they have the charismatic authority to push through some of the bureaucratic inertia.
And then martial arts too.
Sorry?
And then the martial arts.
Right,
as well,
and then that as well, yeah.
Thanks.
So, yeah. But certainly I've heard that said about previous governments as well, bureaucratic inertia,
Okay, well, could you please join me in thanking Professor Michael Leach and indeed all our speakers.